Hi there and welcome to this video on NGRX effects. This continues from the first video in this series and the first article over at, of course, developer.school. Once again, you can see the article and get the code for this article over at developer.school. I'll put the link to this inside of the description and, of course, the comments. So this is the application we'll be building. This is our shopping list that looks daringly similar to the one we built before. But as you can see, we are going to be making some substantial changes to the way that it works. And that's because we'll be adding effects by interacting with asynchronous data inside of a HTTP server and so on. So with that in mind, let's make sure that we have the previous version of the shopping list by cloning this repository or simply downloading it as a zip file. And once we have that, we can head back over to Visual Studio Code, providing that we have the application up and running. So prior to adding NGRX effects, we first have to consider what a side effect is. Now, a lot of the time, this can be boiled down to simply the question, am I dealing with the network or another asynchronous task? Well, if you are, most likely that's a side effect. Anytime that we're sort of not doing something synchronously, but we have to wait, and then something can either succeed, something can fail, that's something that you most likely want to use an effect for. So the effect becomes a middleware to the store, and then listens for each action, and then we can say, hey, does this action match this particular type? For example, something like add item. If it does, we want to go away and make our side effect. So that would be calling our REST API or whatever it is. And then if that succeeds, we may want to call an add item success or an add item failure. With that in mind, let's upgrade this NGRX store application to use NGRX effects. So the first thing that I want to do is to persist our shopping items within a database. You can use any sort of API you want for this. I'm going to be using something called Json server. So we can simply install Json server by opening up our terminal and typing npm install json-server-g. This will install it globally. I'm going to make the assumption that you may want to use Json server across a couple of projects, so it's easier than simply installing it inside of this one. So what it is, it's a file-based database and it exposes a REST API. This REST API is then based off the JSON schema. So for example, if you had a list of shopping items, you'd have localhost 3000/shopping. That would then of course return us the shopping array, and we'll go ahead and create that now. So once you've installed JSON server globally, you can then go ahead and create a db.json, and that db.json will contain our shopping items. So let's make a new JSON object. And inside of here, we'll say shopping and simply put that to be an empty array for now. And if we then type JSON server db.json, that will essentially point it towards this file. We'll see we have this resources at the bottom that we can then open up the terminal as an example and use curl to say https or http localhost 3000/shopping. And we get back that empty array, of course, because that's exactly what's inside of our shopping at the moment. So we can then add something. Let's add it once again with the ID of 1. And afterwards, we'll give this a name of Pepsi Max. And when we save this, we will need to restart the server, and that's simply because we've changed it here on the local environment. If we were to use this via an API of some sort, then it would have its own internal state at that point. But because we've directly modified this JSON file, we'll have to restart the server. So you can get rid of the server with Ctrl+C, and then we can run JSON server once again. Now at this stage, we can use curl to get access to that, and we can see that we have this array which contains that one object, which is of course our ID of 1 and Pepsi Max. At the same time, we could also say shopping/1, and that's the ID at this point. And based on the ID, it would give us that one object. So now you can see we don't have an array, we just simply have an object. So that's a quick rundown of JSON server. You could of course skip this if you don't want to use JSON server and dive straight into the next step. And that will be of course creating a shopping service. So we can use the Angular CLI for this, and we can say ng generate service shopping. I'll go ahead and create us a shopping service. And then we can use the HTTP client to interface with that API. So our shopping service is going to be quite simple. We will have a private shopping URL, and that will be equal to our local host 3000/shopping, and that's going to be the API endpoint that you want to talk to. So if you don't want to use JSON server, or you're using this in your project, you'll have to have a different URL. Then we can inject the HTTP client, and that of course is imported from @angular/common/HTTP. After that, we can go ahead and create 3 methods. We want get shopping items. We then want add shopping item. And finally, we have delete shopping item. Now, I'm being purposely verbose at this point. You could just call this get, add, and delete if you want to. And for each one of these things, we want to return this.http dot, and in this circumstance, it will be get. We want to get the shopping URL. And for the future, I'm going to be using a loading indicator. So I do want to pipe this. And when we pipe it, we'll say delay, and we'll put a delay of 500 milliseconds. We'll have to import delay. So we can come to the top and say import delay from RxJS/operators. Obviously, in your production project, you don't want to use delay unless you have a very good reason to do so. But for us, we want to sort of change the color of this box shadow here on the shopping list to indicate that we are loading an item. So we will do this for every one of our methods. We can return for our add shopping item a HTTP post of this.shopping URL, and then we'll post in a shopping item. So we will need that as a payload here. So we'll say shopping item of type shopping item. So we will need to ensure that we import that shopping item from our store. That just allows us to statically type that. And once again, we will pipe a delay onto the end of that. And finally, for our delete shopping item, we can have this.http.delete, and we want to pass in the this.shopping URL / the ID. And that ID is going to be what we want to delete. We'll also pipe that with a delay. And finally, we'll need an ID as a payload like that. So that's effectively our shopping service at this point. All we have is 3 key methods, and that's going to allow us to interface with our API, and we'll be using this inside of our effect. Next up, we'll need to head over to appmodule.ts, and inside of here, we want to come down to the imports, and we'll import from @Angular common HTTP, and we want the HTTP client module. That's because we've been using the HTTP client inside of that service. We'll also then need to import that inside of our core imports here. So it's the HTTP client module, and now we'll be able to access that service. Next up, we need to make our actions more async friendly. So we'll head over to our shopping actions, and right now we have this add item and delete item. Well, I also want a load shopping. We can say shopping, load shopping. And we'll need to create some classes for our action types in a moment. But I want to just quickly discuss this. So our load shopping will load the shopping. It will talk to an API, and that API will either succeed or it will fail. The same will happen for our add item. We aren't just doing this locally, we are pushing that to the API, and the same goes for the delete item. So let's take these shopping action types, and I'm just going to paste them in from the article. Essentially, we just have a very basic load shopping, succeed and failure, add item, succeed and failure, and finally delete item, succeed and failure. We'll then need to go ahead and create particular classes for each one of these actions. Once again, the article has all of this for you to copy, and you can simply copy this in. So I'm going to copy it over the current actions and paste it in like that. We'll just simply run over what we've done here. Essentially, we are creating 3 classes for each action. It will either be the load action, then we have a success or a failure that has a type, which will either be load shopping at this point and no payload, because when we load the shopping items, we're essentially saying to the store that this is what we intend to do. We don't actually have the items at this point. Only after talking to the API and either succeeding or failing, that's when we'll have that payload. This shopping failure action should likely be an error, so let's change that from string to error. I'll update the article about that too. Okay, so now that we've updated our actions and we have some different action types, we've also made sure to export these as a potential shopping action. We then need to update our application state. So let's head over to our app-state.model, and instead of simply just being an array of shopping item equal to shopping, I want to go ahead and create a shopping state. So we'll go ahead and do that inside of the reducer, and we'll say that this shopping state has a list of shopping items, and that's going to be an array. We'll then have a loading option and any potential errors. We can update our initial state, and the initial state can now simply be of type shopping state. Instead of being an array, we'll turn this into an object. The object will have a list of simply an empty array to start with. We won't be loading initially. And finally, we'll have an error of undefined. We then need to update our shopping reducer, and we'll say that this is no longer going to be an array of shopping items. It's going to be of type shopping state. And this will break our reducer because we won't be actually using this array here anymore. Instead, we'll be having this object, and the object itself will simply part the list to be the action.payload for our add item. But the add item is no longer going to be the action that adds the item to the list. That would be, of course, the success. We'd also set loading to be false, and we'll follow the same pattern here for our delete item. That would be a delete item success. We would then have, of course, our object like so. We could pass in the previous state. We could set the list equal to that filter, and we'd need to filter over the state.list. And finally, we'd set loading to be false because we are no longer loading, and then we can save. So once again, I have the final version of this reducer on the article, so you can simply copy this in and it will go over every single option for that reducer. So let's do exactly that. We'll just quickly run over this. So as you can see, we have the shopping reducer. We then have the option to load shopping as an example. It will set loading to true. Once that has succeeded, we'll get the list, and that will be the payload at that point. We'll set the list equal to that payload. We'll then set loading to false. The same goes for the failure. We'll need to also set loading to false here inside of the failure, so make sure you do that. And then of course, we will set the error to the action.payload. So we can do a lot better than this. This is quite weighty, and you can imagine that if we had a lot of actions, it would get out of control. So there's something called NGRX entity, and we'll be looking at that in the future about how we can integrate that into our application. For now, we're sort of focused on effects. So we'll continue with what we have right now. We're finally at the part where we can look at using the effects. So let's now open up our file menu with Ctrl B. We'll make a new folder called effects. And inside of effects, we'll make a shopping.effects.ts. So an effect is essentially just a service. We can export a class called shopping effects. We can then import from @Angular core, and we want injectable. And we can make this class injectable. And NGRX effects will be handling the registration of this effect and service, so we don't need to provide this anywhere. We'll be providing it as part of the module imports, and we'll look at that in a moment. But for now, you can see we have this shopping effects. We want to use the effect decorator, so that comes from NGRX effects, and that means we'll have to go over to our terminal and install NGRX effects. That's done with npm install @ngrx/effects. And you can also add this if you're comfortable with NGRX using ng-add @ngrx effects. And this will use the Angular CLI and the schematics to do a lot of the work for you regarding setup. So let's pull in that effect now from importing from @ngrx effects, and we want the effect decorator, like so. I also know that I'll be using something called actions, and I'll also need of type. So take all of them things from NGRX effects. We can then say load shopping, and that's going to be an observable in the sense that we'll need to pipe over all of the actions. So that means we need actions. Head over to the constructor and we'll inject actions dollar of type actions. That'll give us the ability to listen to the actions that are fired throughout the application. So we can say this.actions dollar. We can pipe on that. Then we can say, is the action of type load shopping action? And then we need to pass in the string variant of this action. So we'll need our shopping action types dot load shopping. So once we know that we have access to this action, essentially this is being fired inside of our application. Whenever we've dispatched load shopping, we want to then merge that observable, and we're using merge map because this is then going to give us the ability to map over that. It gives us the opportunity to say this dot, and then we want to access the shopping service. So let's inject the shopping service of type shopping service. Make sure you import that as always. So when we have our shopping service, we want to call get shopping items. We'll also need to add merge map from rxjs/operators. So at this stage, we now have an observable. This observable can be piped over. So we can say .pipe. And if this is successful using map, we'll need to import map from rxjs/operators. We should get the data back. And at that point, we can return a new load shopping action. Actually, that should be a load shopping success action. And that's because this is a successful request. And then we'll pass in that data. That will be the shopping items. And we have this issue at this point because our type of object is not assignable to this shopping item array. And that's fine. What we need to do is head over to the shopping service, and we can type our HTTP request as a shopping item array. When we do that, it will fix our effects. It'll no longer complain. So once this has been successful, we fire this load shopping success. But if it isn't successful, then we want to catch error. That error can then return a new load shopping failure action, and it can pass through the error. But this will have to be an observable, so we need to use of at this point. Once again, we'll need to import catch error and import of from rxjs. So that's essentially how we write an effect. We're listening to the actions inside of our application. Then if the action type matches the action that we're looking for, we can then either switch map, merge map, or whatever, concat map any sort of operator that matches your use case. We can then call our service that gets back the data. At that point, we have this new observable that we can pipe and map over. This map contains the data, which is the array of shopping items. Then we can fire that new shopping success action with the data, but on the instance that there is an error, we want to return a load shopping failure action. In the article, I have examples for 2 of the other effects, so let's simply paste those in, like so. We will need to, of course, import the various actions. And I'll quickly run over exactly what's happening. So we have a very similar setup to before. We're listening to all the actions. If they match add item action, then we're calling that add shopping item with the data.payload. So the payload, of course, at this point is the item that we're looking to add. So we are passing a payload to this add item. That's then calling that service. If that is successful, we're simply just passing the payload of the initial action. And finally, if we have an error, of course, we're displaying the error. Same thing goes for, of course, the delete shopping action. We are passing the data payload based on the delete item, and that's going to be the ID. If it's successful, we fire this action. Otherwise, we are going to fire the delete item failure action. Let's fix that. So now that we've written our effects, we can go ahead and add the effects module into our app.module.ts. So underneath our store module, we might have an effects module. And because this is the root of the application, this is the app module. If this was a feature module, we'd use for feature, but because it's the root, we use for root. And we pass in the root effects. As you can see, this is an any type of an array. So we'll pass in our shopping effects. We will need to import that too. And when we save the file, we can now look at hooking up our user interface to use these effects. So to make this easier on the both of us, I'm going to copy paste the UI template as well as the loading class inside of the app component.scss. We'll just add it at the bottom there. And finally, we need to head over to the app component.ts. So here's where all of the magic happens effectively. We have this shopping items. We have a new shopping item, but we don't have access to loading and we don't have access to error. So let's make a loading dollar of observable boolean. Same goes for a error dollar observable error. Now we could add a dollar to the shopping items at this point, but we'd have to rename things and it wouldn't match the previous tutorial, so we'll leave it like it is. Finally, on our ng on init, we can select from the store, so we'll set the loading equal to this dot store dot select. We'll get the instance of the store and we'll say store dot shopping dot, and then at that point we can say loading. Now we run into an issue at this stage, and that's because we need to update our app state.module. Looks like I forgot to do that. So we can say instead of being array of shopping items, it's a shopping state. So we can remove shopping item and save the file. When we head back to, of course, our app component, we need to update our shopping items to be part of shopping list. And you can imagine what we have to do for the error. We'll put that to shopping error. Now you could simply just select the store.shopping and then you wouldn't have to make these three things here like we are, but that's fine. I'm just simply displaying that this is possible. So when we have the error, the loading and the shopping items, we can use that to drive our user interface. And we'll kick this all off by saying this.store.dispatch, and we want to dispatch a new load shopping action. And let's make the screen a little larger. And you'll see that when we refresh the page, we have this pink drop shadow. And that is used to indicate that something is currently loading. And if we look inside of our app component.html, you can see that inside of the div here, we're binding to the loading class if loading is equal to true. And that's using the async pipe. Otherwise, we only want to show this if there isn't an error. Well, at this moment, there is no error. We'll look at that in a moment. What I do want to focus on is this load shopping and load shopping success. So you can see in this action inside of the Redux DevTools here, we have this loading which is initially false. We then make it true. And then after 500 milliseconds, we're calling this load shopping success that has the shopping list. And finally, we are setting loading to be false. So if we add an item to the list and hit enter, you can see initially it has that pink background because it's loading. And then we have add item and add item success. So let's take a look at how this looks. We have the add item, it's currently loading. When it's successful, we have the state, and we were looking at the diff there. So that's the difference between these two states. But in the actual state tree itself, we can see we have the list of 2 items, and this one has a different ID because we're generating that one with UUID, whereas this one is hard-coded inside of our db.json. Using JSON server, we don't even need to generate the ID. We could remove that, but I'm going to leave it in for now. And finally, if we click an item, we have a delete item and a delete item success. So you probably want to have an optimistic update though. If you're making an application like this and we add an item to the list, we don't want to have to wait until we get a response from the server before we update the list. We should do it locally, and we can have an easy way to do that when we look at Narwhal's NX workspaces and their optimistic updates. That's something we'll be looking at in the future, but for now, this has been NGRX effects, building on top of our shopping list that we created with NGRX Store. And I hope that you found this useful. I certainly had fun making it. If you'd like to see more content like this, let me know inside of the comments. If you want to see more NGRX specifically, let me know as well. So like I said, you can find this article for this video over at developer.school, and the article will be in the description. Thanks a lot. Don't forget to subscribe for more content, and I'll see you soon in my next video.